Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Our center is honored today to co-convene today's three-part virtual symposium, The Parallels Between Genocide Denial in the Balkans and Holocaust Distortion, with the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, which is one of the world's leading academic institutions for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and East Central Europe. The Harriman Institute's mission is to serve the community at Columbia University and beyond by supporting research, instruction, and dialogue, sponsoring vibrant and multidisciplinary events that bring together its extraordinary resources of faculty, students, and alumni. The Institute is committed to training the next generation of regional specialists to play leadership roles in setting the academic and scholarly agenda, making policy, and challenging accepted truths about how we study our rapidly changing world. Our conversation today concerns the increasingly and disturbingly rise in the way history and collective memory of the Holocaust has been weaponized, as well as the similarities with the dangerous trend in the denial of genocide and mass atrocities committed across the Western Balkans during both World War II and the wars of the 90s. It's also a very timely event given the widespread war crimes, crimes against humanities, and accusations of genocide being committed by the Russians during the war it's currently waging in Ukraine. Our panel today is entitled Deconstructing the Parallels Between the Holocaust Distortion and Genocide Denial, and features four special guests: Ms. Riata Ashimovitz-Akyol, Dr. Hitmet Karcic, Dr. James Smith, and Dr. Robert Williams. Our session is 90 minutes and will include short presentations by each of our speakers, followed by a discussion which I will moderate. We encourage you to submit your questions and comments via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for those of you tuning in via Zoom. And all three parts of today's symposium are being recorded and will be available on the Harriman Institute's YouTube channel. So to kick things off, I'd like to introduce Ms. Riata Ashimovitz-Akyol. She's a storyteller, opinion writer, and public speaker, and contributing editor to New Lines magazine. Ms. Akyol is founder and host of the Dignified Resilience podcast, and her essays on politics, genocide, religion, and culture have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and Al Jazeera, amongst others.
Hi, Laura. Hello, everyone. Good morning to those in the audience. Dear panelists, esteemed guests, and all those who are watching us today, thank you. I'm truly honored to be invited. I'd like to, from the very start of my remarks, convey my sincere gratitude to the organizers for acknowledging the importance of remembrance and this sort of gathering. And I'd like to convey my utmost respect for all the survivors and scholars, journalists, colleagues, and professionals whom I have been learning from throughout the years, and all those who tirelessly continue fighting Holocaust distortion, genocide denial in all its various forms and different types through their intellectual work and activism. It's been, I think, 9 years so far that I've been writing and reading about Bosnian genocide in professional terms, that is. I've relied on and followed interdisciplinary scholarship and from various disciplines to try to find always different angles, adequate ways to present to my global audience in a journalistic form of essay writing the ideologies, the disasters, not just of a genocide and the pain to a whole people across the generations, and also what ensued in Bosnia and its aftermath, but to try as well to make and present the connections to my readers and to those who in my audience of why those horrors that happen should matter everywhere, to those who care for democracy, for sure, wherever they are, for a broader idea of fight against fascism, racism, and barbarism, and at least to try to make my audience believe that what happened and the atrocities that happened don't happen just somewhere over there, but that they can really happen everywhere. As we've seen, the never again has become, oh, it's happened again, or even in the present tense, it is happening again. That said, I've thought about what I would say in this 5 to 7 minutes remarks, considering many of you are experts and aware of the importance of this gathering. And I want to reiterate just at the beginning, my understanding, of course, that none of this negates specificities of each of these atrocities, but that I truly believe in the value of seeking and finding the commonalities and what we'll talk about here today. So that said, there are and there have been different frameworks. Social scientists, political scientists have brought forward in terms of observing genocide denial, Bosnian genocide denial, even Holocaust genocide denial. For example, Dr. Hamza Karčić has brought forward 4 identifiable stages of Bosnian genocide denial over the last 3 decades. We can talk about it, or we have NGOs in Serbia, for example, that have identified, I believe, 6 phases of denial over there, which they call zones of responsibility. But I've envisaged my remarks today as I prepared and tried to really put this together through a couple of points, if I may say so. When we speak about these parallels, first thing that comes to my mind as I was thinking about it is, okay, so usual arguments, the recap. There are common rhetorical tactics that should be talked about, or that there is a parallel despite differences among the groups that engage in the denial as well, from white supremacists and far right to far left, how they interact, for example. There are echoes, and we see a widespread usage of conspiracy theories as an important element. We see a lot of historical revisionism, alternative histories, and themes of victimhood and existential threat, which of course have served and always serve as a justification for crimes committed afterwards, which leads me to second point or theme in terms of lived experience, right? Of the survivors of the genocide and the denial and how that affects them. What does it mean for the survivors to live while many of them in Bosnia still keep looking for the remnants of the loved ones? While they have to listen for the threats, certainly Republika Srpska entity, but broadly, that they have to continue listening to pushes for breakup of the country. As the political project of the genocide denial goes on in Bosnia, in Republika Srpska, in the region as well, alongside triumphalism and glorification. What does exhaustion of the survivors in terms of their lived experience when we speak about genocide denial weigh in terms of us always talking about it? What does it mean that survivors have to deal with trivializations in many languages, online and offline, with different techniques of genocide denial? And speaking of lived experience, then it leads me to point to beauty of the solidarity, almost always, of those who have survived these atrocities. And that leads me to what I thought was the third kind of point in terms of consequences. Why speaking about the genocide denial matters in terms of dehumanization, pain, re-traumatization, and also because the consequences are deadly, which we have seen from New Zealand to Norway to USA. And plus, of course, if we speak about consequences, we have to envisage, and maybe we can speak about it in Q&A, about the digital sphere, a wholly new aspect of genocide denial and how internet has amplified massively, how the nature of the denial is changed in the online sphere. And of course, that could lead me to next theme that I've been thinking about, and that's controversies. For example, the 2 expert commissions that Republika Srpska has assembled in 2019 that Dr. Rosensaft wrote so well of, the manipulation of Holocaust in Eastern Europe, as we've heard this morning as well. And then finally, action. How do we fight it? There's a whole panel on memorialization afterwards, which is very worthwhile. But when I speak about how do we fight it in terms of this panel here, I'm talking about the questions that I've been posing to myself as well. And the answers are not pretty, in my opinion. And that is that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as crucial aspects of the denials of these 2 projects are so deeply ingrained that I don't know, the more I read about it, whether it really could be changed, or we just have to keep fighting to eradicate it. So I'll finish this 5 to 7 remarks here by just pointing out, as I've said in one of the previous panels that I attended, that unless the incentives change, and in case of Bosnian genocide denial, but otherwise as well, it's often similar, that is that there are economic incentives. A lot of money has been pumped by several organizations, let alone governments, to this. There are political, ideological incentives, those that signal identity. And considering that we have leadership in many countries, or the geopolitical conjuncture in Europe or in the United States, or broader actually, that has been allowing this anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to thrive, I feel that it's not obviously going to stop, but I see no other choice and no other option than to keep talking about it, to keep fighting these deadly ideologies, to keep making connections with all of us who care. So thank you for your attention and time. I look forward to listening to all other esteemed guests in our conversation afterwards.
Thank you so much, Riata. I was just taking notes, and I really appreciate you framing this around 4 sort of core themes, which I think will help guide the conversation. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Hikmet Karcic. He's a genocide and Holocaust scholar based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Dr. Karcic was the 2017 Auschwitz Institute Keene State College Global Fellow, who has written extensively on genocide denial and atrocity prevention. He's a sought-after commentator on international media outlets, and his articles covering far-right extremism and mass atrocities have appeared in Haaretz, Newsweek, and Foreign Policy, and his latest book, Torture, Humiliate, Kill, Inside the Bosnian Serb Camp System, was published by the University of Michigan Press earlier this year. Hikmet, the floor is yours.
Sorry. Thank you, Laura. Thanks to the Herman Institute and for once again, tackling some of the major issues in the Western Balkans and in Eastern Europe today. So basically, my short presentation will be an addition to Riada's previous presentation, and basically, in my line of work in the past several years, dealing concretely with the issue of genocide denial and revisionism here in the Balkans, what we can see actually when it comes to the Bosnian genocide is that the theories which were used by the Bosnian Serbian establishment during the 1990s, once the crimes were being committed, such as in the 1992 Red Line Street massacre or the Srebrenica genocide in 1995, the same theories are still being upgraded and used today by different conspiracy theorists, by different historians and things like that. And you have this whole entire pattern of basically a line of different media, which is constantly on anniversaries producing and reproducing the same news. Now, the most scaring part of all is that 20 years ago, and when the internet just started to appear, there were only a few websites online where you could find these kind of theories. I remember a few websites called in 1999 called Serbiana.com or Serbian Cafe or the Emperor's Clothes, which were a leftist website, which had these kind of. So these were basically websites which were on the margins of society. These were the same people who believed that the Earth was flat and that aliens made the pyramids and things like that. But now, what's happening today is that this outright denial of crimes which were committed in Bosnia have become mainstream, funded by state institutions. So, to give you one quick example, on the 25th of May 1995, there was a huge massacre of around 70 kids and teenagers in Tuzla, the infamous Kapja massacre. And the Ministry of Defense of Serbia financed a report, academic book, a research project to deconstruct this massacre, and actually the end result of this whole entire so-called research was that this was a false flag operation conducted by the Bosnian government in order to get sympathy from the West. So these kind of theories, which you can find among Serbian propaganda, and which goes in line with some of these small pro-communist websites online and so on, is something very similar to what we can see here today in the case of Ukraine. So, reading about, watching the Russian ministry spokesperson talking about the Bucha massacre, or about the bombardment of the railway station, the arguments being used there very similarly coincide with the rhetoric being used by the Milosevic regime. So we have come to this era of post-truth, in an era where facts don't matter, where you can show a photograph, a video clip of bodies being blown up by shells and things like that, and people just not taking it into consideration or saying that this is propaganda. Now, the other issue which I want also to point out is that similarly to for example, the Russian so-called denazification operation in Ukraine, the Milosevic regime, their propaganda actually said that in Bosnia they were fighting against a combined force of Ustasha, World War II Croatian fascist movement, and Muslim terrorism. So basically, several times in the ICTY, in the Hague Tribunal, genocidaires such as Ratko Mladic and Karadzic and so on, they were basically using this argument that they were fighting Al-Qaeda in Bosnia in the 1990s, long before the West was, and that they were actually protecting the West from a Muslim invasion from within. So basically, the whole war in the former Yugoslavia, which culminated with the Kosovo War and the bombardment of Serbia and NATO in 1999, gave wings to this whole theory of a world conspiracy against the Orthodox countries in Eastern Europe. So, for example, if you read Serbian media on the anniversary of the NATO bombardment, you can see that it was some sort of combined conspiracy by NATO, the Vatican, and the Muslim International against Belgrade, Russia, and the rest. So today, what we can see in regarding to the Bosnian genocide is a denial of infamous massacres. So massacres such as Srebrenica, the massacres around Srebrenica, the Srebrenica genocide, the massacres in Markale, Breadline, Kapia, and other locations which are popular and which are actually infamous for the brutality in which they were committed. And we see these the same modus operandi, the same tactics, the same patterns being used in this way. So the first thing, which if you want to somehow draw a parallel with Holocaust distortion, the first thing what we can see is bringing into question the numbers of people killed, the numbers of people buried. For example, in Srebrenica, where almost so right now around 7,500 people are buried in Srebrenica out of 8,372. The Serbian media always project some sort of they question whether people were actually buried inside these graves, or whether these were people brought from outside, or whether these were animal bones and things like that. So and currently, these denialists actually bring into question DNA analysis, and each victim in Srebrenica has a DNA analysis and a DNA match, basically, for the exhumation from the mass grave. And secondly, what we can see is this sort of so-called preventive war, which is often being used by the Serbian media by saying, we had to intervene in Bosnia and start a war with the Muslims, because otherwise they would have gotten rid of the Serbs in Bosnia. So this sort of demographic bomb in which these population projections in which Bosnian Muslims would create an overall majority in Bosnia by the year 2050. This massive population of Bosnia, this different theories, a sort of great replacement theory of some sort was being very popular at that time. This small group of Bosniak Muslims who control the media, control the government, control everything else, control the wealth and things like that. So you can, if you go deeper into this sort of research, you can find a lot of similarities with Holocaust distortion from this time. I think I have talked almost, yes. So I will stop.
Thank you so much, Hikmet. I think questioning numbers and this idea of a preventive war is something that will definitely come up when we start talking as a group. I'd like to now bring in Dr. James Smith. He's the co-founder of the UK's National Holocaust Centre and Museum, which was established in 1995, the same year of the Srebrenica genocide. And as a medical doctor, Dr. Smith worked with the International Medical Corps in 1999 in Albania during the Kosovo crisis. He co-founded the Aegis Trust in the year 2000, and in 2004, he worked with survivors and the Kigali City Council to establish a Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda's capital at a site where 250,000 victims of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi lie buried, which receives thousands of visitors each year and is the base from which the Aegis Trust Peace Education Program has been developed. And Dr. Smith also visited Darfur in 2004 and was part of the first NGO head to call for its referral to the International Criminal Court. Dr. Smith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to the Harriman Institute for having me today. So, every human life is equal, and it's already been stated by other participants that we need to avoid comparative suffering. And so we need to remind ourselves, why are we having this conversation about denial and distortion? And the first is understanding the motives for those that distort and deny genocide, principally to avoid accountability, cultural accountability and judicial accountability for the crimes. Secondly, it rehabilitates the perpetrators and those that continue to hold the ideology of the extremists. And finally, a point that Riada made quite eloquently was that it creates fear and trauma among survivors. So it's a hugely important conversation, and I really thank you to Tanya and Laura for organizing and bringing us together today. Gregory Stanton has been quoted often as saying that denial is the last stage of genocide. And I've reflected on this many times, particularly around a decade ago when I was in the Nuba Mountains and in a village where civilians had been attacked by Antonov bombers, and cluster bombs had been dropped on the villages. And it was very clearly that civilians and women and children were being targeted. There wasn't any evidence at the time, although there was a rebellion taking place. There was certainly no evidence of military in that region, or opposition military. And yet the narrative of the government of Sudan was that they were undertaking a counter-insurgency exercise. And we saw this in relation to Darfur, and Menachem Rosensaft spoke about this earlier today in relation to the Nazi narrative. And what is clear when we're thinking about this genocide being the last stage of genocide is that actually it's probably one of the first stages, because denial and distortion begins before the atrocities, they continue during the atrocities, and they persist after the atrocities. Denial strategies are the ultimate gaslighting, blaming the victim for their situation in which they find themselves. We've heard from Hikmet just now, and earlier from Menachem Rosensaft, how the victim group are often portrayed as being an existential threat to the larger society. And I was struck by a campaign that the Simon Wiesenthal Center were involved in probably about 15 years ago now, back in 2008, when the European Parliament declared a joint day of remembrance for those that had been victims of totalitarianism. And why would was Ephraim Zorov, as the leader of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, so sort of exercised about this? Because on the one hand, if we assert that everyone's equal, then doesn't it make sense that all victims of the Second World War and totalitarianism are remembered together? But it doesn't take long to drill down to see the sort of less noble reasons why there was this relativization of the crimes between Stalin and Hitler. And in particular, the spokesperson for the Lithuanian mission to the European Union at the time was sort of confusing with numbers and confusing with the truth. He described how Lithuania lost more than 780,000 of its residents, 444,000 having fled Lithuania during the Second World War, or were repatriated, that 225,000 were deported to the Gulag or in exile, and that 25,000 resistant fighters were killed and 25,000 more died on the front. And then by comparison, he said more than 200,000 citizens of Jewish origin were killed by the Nazis and their collaborators. And there wasn't anything in those statements that was incorrect. But what it did is omit to state that 90% of Lithuanian Jews had been murdered during the Nazi occupation with help from Lithuanian nationalists. And it's this that Efraim Zorov described as being far more serious in his view in terms of distortion and denial than any of the denial that we've been seeing for the past 30, 40 years in Western Europe. Why? Because it became mainstream, and diplomats and agencies and scholars were adopting these approaches and these ideas. And this was a time, by the way, so I know I've got to stop talking in a minute and I'll be able to expand on these points later, but this was a time when Lithuania was investigating the then head of Yad Vashem, Israel's foremost Holocaust remembrance and research center, because he had been a Jewish communist who'd become the director of Yad Vashem, and he's investigating for his role in the NKVD. And so this was, again, never mind all the Lithuanian collaborators in the Holocaust, the spotlight was on a Jewish Bolshevik, and so this was a sort of environment that was going on at the time. And the final comment I just want to make about how this was a continuation. This is the Jewish idea of the Jewish Bolshevik being a threat, an existential threat to either the Baltic states or to Germany, was used in the propaganda of the Nazis well before the invasion of the Soviet Union, during the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the narratives continue even to this day. And it's just the final point you mentioned, Laura, that I was in Kosovo, actually Albania, in 1999, and that just reminded me how the Serbian Academy of Science and Arts had released that report in 1996, accusing Kosovan Albanians of committing genocide against Serbs. So this tipping it on its head, that it's the Serbs who are the victims under this existential threat, stoking fear. That was very much, I think, parallel with the fear and incitement of this concept of the Jewish Bolshevik that the Nazis propagated. Anyway, I'll stop there because I see I'm well over time.
Thank you so much. And Riyad, I was listening to one of your podcasts and you were talking about essentialism, and we'll come back to this point in the discussion. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert Williams. He's Deputy Director for International Affairs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Williams sits on the steering committee of the Global Task Force Against Holocaust Distortion and served for 4 years as chair of the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. He regularly advises international organizations and governments on anti-Semitism and Holocaust issues, and is currently overseeing a major initiative that assesses European Holocaust and genocide denial laws. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. And thank you to my co-panelists for a very interesting discussion. And listening to all of you, it's become increasingly clear that we need to be a bit more overt about implications of what we see, whether it's in the Western Balkans or in the Russian invasion of Ukraine or elsewhere. Distortion of history, cynical politics of memory, is a real threat to international security and peace, and it needs to be addressed. But I digress. That's not why I've been asked to speak today. I'm going to focus on genocide distortion as it relates to the Holocaust. Now, unlike Holocaust denial, which is a cynical attempt to convince people that the Holocaust never happened, Holocaust distortion really consists of different approaches to excuse, minimize, or otherwise misrepresent the Holocaust and its present-day relevance. It takes on at least 10 basic forms. I can link to a recent publication that I edited in the chat in a moment. And these 10 forms, some of which might be unintentional, morph and take on different degrees of urgency due to the circumstances of the moment. Now, does somebody distort for hateful reasons, or do they distort because they don't know the facts? The answer is both. But to a certain extent, the motivation doesn't really matter, because on a moral level, distortion insults memories of victims and survivors. And on a practical level, it really opens the door to conspiracy thinking, to outright denial of a genocide, and to more dangerous forms of hate like anti-Semitism. Now, I can't review all 10 for the sake of time, so I want to focus in on one form in particular: efforts to absolve, glorify, or otherwise gloss over the words and deeds of persons complicit in the Holocaust and other crimes of the Second World War. For the sake of shorthand, I'll call this rehabilitation. Now, we see rehabilitation in other contexts, including in recent US debates over Confederate monuments or in certain dynamics in the former Yugoslavia. Wherever we see it, rehabilitation shares certain characteristics, namely an attempt to turn villains into heroes, to create a usable vision of the past. And within the context of the Holocaust, rehabilitation is not new. Soon after 1945, the Western Allies began passing a series of amnesty laws in Germany to allow for the reconstitution of the civil service and other professions. This amnesty only expanded after the foundation of West Germany in 1949, and by 1950, according to Norbert Frey, there were only some 3,400 war criminals remaining in Western prisons, a number that halved within a year. And the reason for this decline in the number of convicted criminals was due to public pressure. In January of 51, for example, some 4,000 West Germans, including local politicians, went to Landsberg prison in Bavaria to protest the US-led imprisonment and executions of Nazi war criminals. At that time, those set to be hanged included Otto Ohlendorf, the head of Einsatzgruppe D, the special action group that carried out atrocities against more than 90,000 people across Ukraine in 1941. Now, Ohlendorf still met his fate, but public outcry like this had an effect. Many of those still imprisoned at the time had their sentences annulled, including some of the worst perpetrators, like Martin Sandberger, the head of Einsatzgruppe 1A. Sandberger was responsible and admitted responsibility for the murders of at least 350 people in Estonia. Now, he received a death sentence in 1948 that the Americans commuted to life in 1951, but this was not enough. Prominent non-Nazi Germans, like the SPD's Carlo Schmitt, one of the authors of the Basic Law, and West German President Theodor Heuss, appealed to the United States for a full pardon of Sandberger, with Heuss going so far as to suggest that German courts could find Sandberger not guilty. This pressure led the American authorities to finally give up in May 1958 when they decided to free Sandberger. He finally passed away only 12 years ago in his Stuttgart apartment in 2010. Now, amnesty like this perhaps allowed post-Germany an opportunity for a clean break from a troublesome past. And stability did arrive in West Germany, but by the late 1960s, it became very clear that the past cannot be so easily whitewashed. So let's return to the present. Political distortion of the Holocaust today is not limited just to the rhetoric employed by the Russian president. Holocaust memory has become increasingly weaponized across the international space, and it often manifests through efforts at rehabilitation. For at least 2 decades, there have been significant and perhaps more attempts to rehabilitate the reputations of Holocaust-era personalities. And this seems to correlate with democratic decline and the rise of an intensely nationalistic politics of memory. The rehabilitation of Holocaust-era figures is not unique to former Axis countries or to countries that were occupied by the Axis. We also see it in countries that were neutral during the war and in countries that were part of the alliance, including the UK and the United States. At times, these rehabilitated persons have benefited through official intervention, like a high court overturning a long past sentence. There are a number of recent cases of this, but the most illustrative happened in Slovenia, where there was a successful effort to overturn the death sentence of Leon Rupnik, the Nazi collaborator who was in charge of Ljubljana during the war. Now, Rupnik had been captured, tried, and hanged in 1946, but in January of 2020, the Slovenian Supreme Court overturned this death sentence on a technicality. He's still dead, by the way. Other times, parliaments have taken official actions to bring about rehabilitation. We've seen this in countries that include, but are not limited to, Ukraine and Lithuania. There, many of these rehabilitated include people who were valorized for anti-Soviet efforts, despite the fact that they also collaborated with the Nazis in crimes against Jews, Roma, ethnic Poles, and others. Other individuals have undergone cultural rehabilitation because they were well-known luminaries, like the Ustasha ideologue Mila Budak, even though people like Budak were central to the murderous policies of Nazi-allied regimes. Some are protected by religious authorities, which is a huge complication, and others escaped justice and went on to fame after the war. To this list, we should include some of the Nazi scientists brought here to the United States to work on our rocket program. A few, like Wernher von Braun, received honorifics here in the States, like official statues or buildings that bear their names. There are even cases of rehabilitation outside national contexts. The writings of the Italian fascist ideologue Julius Evola have found purchase in some extreme right-wing circles, and the works of the Belgian SS officer Leon de Grelle can sometimes be bought in legitimate bookstores in Eastern Europe. Now, why is all of this happening? Well, it's in part because of the flaws of collective memory. After all, collective memory only needs a few prompts and a narrative to gain purchase. Better public memory of the past can only come through an honest history built on facts and analysis. Additionally, rehabilitating problematic individuals is also motivated by an attempt to rehabilitate old norms, to make hate acceptable again, or to abandon democratic development in favor of an atavistic politics that rests on jingoism and social strife. All this does is lead to a pernicious and fractured national discourse based on reductive propaganda that undermines democracy and peace. So to achieve a better balance, we need history, not memory, something that, to paraphrase Mark Bloch, seeks a better understanding. To do so requires that we recognize and push back against rehabilitation, that we have a history that reaches non-specialists in ways that resonate, that we are aware that a peaceable future means engaging with the past not as we hope it might have been, but as it actually happened. And finally, a need to address genocide and Holocaust distortion at multiple levels, from selective misuse of evidence, to blaming victims for atrocities, to misusing symbols of hate, to the rehabilitation and glorification of perpetrators. And I think I'm right at time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. I wanted to invite our colleague, my esteemed colleague, Tanya Domi, whose idea it was to put together this symposium. And Tanya is an adjunct assistant professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University and a faculty affiliate of the Harriman Institute, where she teaches human rights and international affairs in the Western Balkans. And she and Hikmet recently co-authored a piece in the 2020 issue of Foreign Policy entitled, "We Need a Better Way to Prosecute Sexual Assault in Conflict." So I wanted to invite Tanya into the dialogue. And I guess one of the things I wanted to throw out as sort of the first question is, when we're talking about rehabilitating memory, rehabilitating history, or war criminals, it feels like this is another way of promoting anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism. And I wanted to invite each of you to sort of comment on sort of these undercurrents, because on one level, we're talking about the erosion of democratic norms and principles. And in the same token, we're seeing across the globe a rise in nationalism and authoritarianism. Hikmet or Robert, would you like to comment first?
Well, I think I alluded to this briefly in my comments. Yeah, I think that they go hand in hand. They also self-reinforce. So to a certain extent, there is a desire to distort in order to create a convenient reality, right? To justify illiberal policies, or to justify shortcuts that states might take. And that may be divorced from particular forms of hate. But when it comes to things that touch upon the Holocaust or other genocides, inevitably it leads to, let me back up and let's take a hypothetical. I don't want to impugn any one particular country, but let's say you were a country occupied by the Nazis and you decide that it's not very convenient to talk about what your grandfathers may or may not have done in collaboration with the Nazis during the course of the Second World War. So you erase that from official memory. But then as you enter the European Union or any one of a number of international organizations, you encounter organizations or governments who have had a more eyes wide open approach to the study of history. And allegations, as you would receive it, of collaboration come your way. That can invite not only a defensiveness vis-a-vis other international partners, it can also lead to the rise of a particular form of hate against those ethnic groups who are engaging with the past honestly. Because if your understanding of the past is X and theirs is Y, and Y is based on fact and X is based on propaganda, you're still going to stick to your beliefs. You're not going to allow facts to engage. So that can lead to a rise of anti-Semitism. It can lead to a rise of anti-Roma racism or other forms of bias that creep in. And we've seen this play out over the course of the last 30 odd years since the fall of communism in a number of former Eastern European and Central European countries. And a number of these countries swing toward the norm that we would like them to see. But this goes up and down, and it's played out differently over the last 10 to 15 years as the democratic experiments in some countries have begun to come into question. So that's as vague as I want to be without, impugning anyone in particular.
Well, I can just make a short comment regarding the former Yugoslavia. We had two major things which I think should be pointed out. Firstly, both Croatia and Serbia have, over the last couple of years, I think some 10, 15 years ago, equalized partisan veterans with Nazi collaborators veterans, so people who were members of the Ustaša movement. So they right now get the same pension, which wasn't the case during communist Yugoslavia. And in the case of Serbia proper, they through official courts, they rehabilitated several ethnic leaders who were tried and executed for war crimes and atrocities during the Second World War. The second thing is regarding EU and NATO integration of several of these countries in the region, including, let's say the best examples are Hungary and Croatia. In order for them to get all of these steps forward towards getting into the EU, you could say that they went through some sort of reform. However, once they became part officially of full member state of the European Union, then some sort of radicalization in their home countries started to appear. So, for example, there was an initiative by the Ministry of Education in Croatia 2 years ago to ban the Anna Frank diary because it was too traumatic for the children to read, and the level of denial against the genocide of the Serbs in Jasenovac is still ongoing and it's still state level. So and of course you're much more familiar with Orban's Hungary and the distortion levels going on there. So in reality, right now, what we have are full member states of the European Union, which are right now in a worse position regarding genocide denial and distortion than they were 20 years ago. Because right now they have EU funds, they have control inside, and they are the ones who can right now block other countries regarding their EU and NATO integration. Also, another thing maybe just to mention regarding far-right movements, that is that the rehabilitation process of different Nazi collaborators, both in Hungary and in Bulgaria and in Serbia, have become a magnet for far-right groups and leaders. So, for example, one member of a US far-right group called the Rise Above Movement, led by Robert Rondo, he had attended different marches in Budapest and in Sofia and in Serbia, and he was also in one part in Bosnia as well. Going to, so you have this sort of synchronization of far-right nationalism, extreme nationalism with neo-Nazis and with far-right groups.
I wanted to make a comment, Laura. James mentioned about the genocide denial or Holocaust distortion. It starts not at the end. Denial's not at the end. It actually is at the beginning. And I think we're seeing that in real time in Ukraine right now. And I don't mean to digress to a Ukraine discussion, but it really is parallel to the Bosnian war experience, in that, for example, the Serbs denying Markelum Market massacre, the shelling of it, and they would say, oh, well, the Bosniaks shelled themselves. And we're seeing that play out with the Russians in Ukraine, where their denials just don't hold any credibility when you see the unfortunate outcome of some real atrocities. And so it already has started. It's already started up front in Ukraine. And we know from the experiences in Bosnia, where the Serbs would just deny that it didn't happen, and then you would find a mass grave. And you still have mass graves, which is the ultimate denial of what took place in terms of atrocities and crimes. And let me just add what Hikmet said about far-right groups. Let's just get right to the point about the United States. CPAC, which is an annual conference of the Republican Party, is now doing it. They're scheduled to go to Hungary to hold their CPAC annual political conference with none other than Viktor Orban. I mean, I find this disturbing and yet not surprising. That's the kind of cards we're playing with at this moment. And as Menachem mentioned, social media is a two-edged sword, as we all know, and these things get repeated and repeated by bots that are probably driven by malevolent actors, the Russians and others that have really taken over the internet. And it's advanced far and wide, and then it becomes distorted, and people are not sure about what the truth is if you're not really an earnest person who's going to follow up these things and actually get to the truth of the matter. And part of that process is becoming media literate as well. So I see a combination of things happening that see this all playing out in real time. And it is overwhelming. I agree with Riata about that. It is definitely overwhelming. That's all I have to add. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. I agree absolutely with this idea when we speak about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, that far-right white supremacist groups are primarily the ones that very successfully use both the arguments from the Holocaust and recently that they've mobilized arguments from Bosnian genocide as well. And we've seen that in Bosnian genocide case with Islamophobia as well. And it does lead to, when we speak to Russia, about necessary conversations about Christian nationalism, right? And its place that it has always had in history in terms of anti-Semitism in Bosnia, how the humanization ideologies and greater Serbia ideologies, that Islamophobia is this essential part of that ideology. And now Putin, who kind of sees himself as the leader of these Christian nationalists, together with Orban and others that we've mentioned, and how this sort of anti-Semitic element always comes in, and how it serves as excuse to cleanse something, and get rid of the problems, whether it's liberate from the Ottomans or the Muslim yoke in the case of Bosnian genocide, liberate Europe by these crusaders from the occupiers. And what Hikmet also mentioned, leading us to conspiracy theories, which is very important in terms of the Great Replacement theory. In both cases, we see that, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter who killed 11 people. I mean, he was motivated by that belief of the white genocide, a great replacement. That white Christians will be replaced by, it depends where, right? Racial minorities, religious minorities. In Europe, in the case of Bosnian genocide, we have this Muslim invasions and occupiers rather than globalists. It modifies sometimes depending on the geography, but I think that this great replacement theory and this conspiracy is something that is always in the heart, and we've seen it even in the kebab remover, a famous, renowned reference with Christchurch terrorist who had it on his weapon, who had different parts of the history from Serbia and Montenegro against Ottoman Empire. In his manifesto, he also played Serbian nationalist song before it. We have this parallels of these celebrations, of whether, anti-Semitic and here this Islamophobic thing. And it really, as we've mentioned recently, the fact that it's been taken to mainstream is really problematic. And Tanya has rightly and bravely pointed out a fact of how it's been embraced by some very powerful politicians in the United States right now. And it's absolutely scary to me to see, but not surprising, as Tanya said. And we could speak more about the history and what the Great Replacement theory and the ideology and the place of Islam there has, for example, the way that anti-Semitism is core of Holocaust distortion as well. But the most important thing is this racialization, which takes place before dehumanization. And that's the thing that I've been studying, because I really, and following the scholarship, really wanted to both understand and convey to my readers and the audience the importance and the complexity and the sophisticated cocktail of factors that come together always and that manifest differently, very often deadly, but which always have this racialization and then dehumanization. And I just would like to mention in that way that recently I wrote an essay about it, and I can send it, but just basically talking about this essence, right? And that's the thing that scares me, the essentialization of people. For anti-Semite, right? When we say it doesn't matter whether Jew is an atheist or practicing, the same way that Bosniak, whether it's a Bosniak atheist, so to speak, or very practicing Muslim, for these, people who want to harm and morally engage, by the way, rather than moral disengagement. As we've seen, we have new scholarship saying that these perpetrators morally engage. They see it as a sacred thing. That's why they humiliate and torture. And Hikmet might tell us more. So I think that this dehumanization, this racialization are so important. And we see it in Russia with Russian narratives about Ukraine. We see the repetitions as well. So it's important to understand it and to fight it, because it's so deep and powerful. I don't know, can it be changed? Honestly, and that's the scariest part. Thank you.
Thank you, Riata. I have one more comment, and that is Menachem mentioned homophobia in his opening remarks. And I just want to add that there are a lot of people in the Western Balkans, and think about Ukrainian LGBT people going to Poland for safety when Poland has annexed, and I'm using that term correctly, has annexed, banned LGBT people in specific geographical areas of the country. And so right now people are on tenterhooks. They're worried, they're scared, they're intimidated. And think about who actually passed the law that declared LGBT people illegal. None other than Vladimir Putin himself, the anti-propaganda laws. And I'm worried about creeping Putinism. We've seen it at work in Bosnia, undermining the sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I'm also worried about it in relationship to this distinct group. And I'll leave it there. Thank you. And it's over to James. your comment now, your turn, James.
Thank you, Tanya. I just want to pick up on the first comment that you made in relation to Ukraine, and I agree. We don't want to get too digress onto that, but I couldn't agree with you more that we're seeing denial and distortion real time, and we need to be cognizant of how this distortion is used for a purpose in terms of deflecting accountability, as Robert said, rehabilitating those that are perpetrating crimes. I think, in relation to Russia as well, is tying back to comment that Riada and Hikmet made, and Hikmet reminded some of the Aegis listeners on our recent podcast about the connection with sort of white nationalist terrorism and Islamophobia and its connection to the Western Balkans but I don't think we should also, I think, have some honesty about some of the narratives in sort of Western Europe, North America, how we got a little carried away as well with our own war on terror, which helped to confuse ourselves, I think, to a degree. I refer again, and in danger of opening a complete other conversation with the Russian Chechnya war there. I think many of us bought the Russia defense against global terrorism and as the motive for the destruction in Chechnya, and of course there was radical Islamic terrorism as well in the mix, but I think we failed to call out the imperialist agenda of Putin in the Chechnya war enough, and it's now we of course recognize with hindsight that this was the beginning of many what we're seeing now, the result in Ukraine. But I think we were blinded a little by the big narratives which had airs of Islamophobia about it, and it's been around there a very long time, and it's quite mainstream. It's not only in that the white nationalist agenda. I think we've there's been a huge I think blinding to this sort of whole narrative that we need a little bit more introspection about. Anyway, so I don't want to get onto another conversation about that. Only to say that I think it's been a little bit more mainstream than the white nationalists. I think we've all been guilty of turning a blind eye to this to some form of Islamophobia in the form of war on terror. So I know that's perhaps controversial to say that, but.
Robert, did you have a comment?
Two, actually, but it diverts a bit from where James went. So I hope you'll forgive
Please
me.
bring us back.
So, the first relates to this, a certain aspect to which narratives of genocide can also provide a cover. I don't mean a cover from personal, national, local, regional guilt. I mean a cover for actions that can take place in the present day. Let's take the Holocaust example again. We see time and time again, whether it is in Russian narratives about the liberation of Holocaust sites by the Red Army, whether it is by certain countries that were occupied by the Nazis or other members of the Axis during the war, time and time again, nations say, well, we were either victims of the Nazis during the period, or we had a glorious history during the course of the Second World War, or look at the number of righteous among nations in our national fold, using those positive aspects of Holocaust history as a cover for other actions that we would classify as illiberal or mass atrocity crimes or genocidal, depending on what we're talking about. We see this happening time and time again. So it's important not to lose sight of the fact that positive teaching, learning, or memory of the Holocaust can also be used in a way that is by default a form of propaganda. So there's a danger there, and I wouldn't want us to lose sight of that. I think it's particularly important in the context of the former Yugoslavia, where we have seen these narratives pop up from time to time, including recently. Related to this, and this goes to something that Hikmet had said in his comments, I think one of the reasons we see this operationalizing of Holocaust history take place, especially in the Central and Eastern European context, it kind of comes down to our fault from a Western European, North American perspective being imposed on these regions at a very early stage after the fall of communism. There was a lack of understanding, I think, in the West of the degrees of Stalinist crimes that took place, the degrees of crimes that took place, on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And we did not allow certain European countries who were entering the EU fold an opportunity to work through their own troublesome past. Why was this problematic? Because it has led to, at times, a competition of victimhoods. What is more important in the Ukrainian context, the Holodomor or the Holocaust? Well, they're both important. There's unfortunately an eternal well of suffering that we can adapt to. But instead, it's led to really acrimonious debate that hasn't helped us very far. So I think these are other factors that we need to bear in mind as we look at the ways that these various narratives are operationalized for other ends.
I think the point about narratives and putting victims on the defensive is a significant one in national memory, in global memory. And Tanya hinted or mentioned this before with members of the LGBTQI plus community, but I also wanted to talk about the impact this has on women and children. Today, for example, there's an article in the Times focusing on how the mass exodus of people leaving Ukraine are mostly women and children, and how in Poland, there's not enough resources for them to really make sure that they're going to be okay. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about when we're talking about the denial of these narratives, or we're rehabilitating parts of history where people have been implicated in murdering thousands and millions of people, putting victims in the defensive, putting them in a competitive space with one another, the additional trauma, and also the silencing mechanism. And Hikmet and Tanya, you just wrote an article about how difficult it is for women to seek justice from the rapes, both at an individual level and the mass raping that went on. And I wanted to know if you could comment a little bit about the significance of the use of violence and rape as a tool of war, and the denial of those crimes after the fact.
You want to go first, Hikmet?
Go ahead, Tanya.
Wow, well, this is a huge issue, and I was the work that Hikmet and I did together on this piece is, I felt like I was researching in real time, actually. But now what we are seeing in real time is another war where women are being raped as a tool of war. There's just as a tactic. As a matter of fact, a Kiev journalist just published on Twitter that in Bucha, several women and girls as young as 14 were held and raped in a basement in Bucha. 9 of them are now pregnant. I want everybody to think about this. As I said about LGBT going to Poland, well, guess what? Abortion is illegal in Poland. And so you have rape survivors potentially pregnant with probably no access to abortion medication, which is the morning after pill. This is a terrible situation. And as our article laid out, in the case of Kosovo, only estimated 20,000 rapes, only 1 prosecution in over 20 years. And so what's interesting, and there is some good news here that I personally am aware of, is that the prosecutor general in Ukraine is already getting together and cooperating with the prosecutor of the ICC. They are developing evidence. I was contacted by a member of parliament of Ukraine, and we introduced her to experts in Bosnia about how to deal with and collect forensic evidence and prepare for cases in court. This is a serious problem. It has been happening for centuries with no prosecutions, as in the case of the Comfort women in South Korea. One woman is 93 years old. She has been pressing the government to prosecute her case, and they have dismissed her on this matter. So it's complicated, but as you said, Laura, it is a majority of the refugees are women and children, because the men have to stay according to Ukraine law to fight the war. And so women and children are showing up, and they're very traumatized. And in many cases, they are rape survivors. Hikmet.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so basically, when Tanya and I were finishing up our article for Foreign Policy, I remember that the editor at that time told us to speed it up, because the war in Ukraine had just started, and we were expecting, unfortunately, this kind of news to be out soon. So we speeded up our writing to have it published as soon as possible. Yeah. So one of the most shocking things, and is something which I saw on Twitter today, and that this is a intercepted telephone call which I just shared in the chat between a partner and between a woman and her partner who's a Russian soldier in Ukraine, and she's basically giving him the green light to rape Ukrainian women. She just said, just use protection. Continued laughing. So basically, this brings us back to the to the basics of the dehumanization of the victim group, basically. So to that extent, in which the victims or the targeted group can be dehumanized to that extent that your wife would allow you to commit such a crime, without any consequences. Riada has also written several articles on fight for justice in Bosnia regarding rape, and how Bosnian women basically along with Rwanda, with the Rwandan survivors, basically laid the legal basis for rape to be recognized as a weapon of war. So what we are going to basically see right now in Ukraine and with the Rohingya and with China, with the mass rape of women in China, is a new policy in which it's going to be very hard, and it's going to take a long time for these people for the perpetrators to be prosecuted for their crimes. I think just to add on to what Tanya just mentioned with the issue of Poland. I think right now the main issue should be for the Catholic Church and for the Vatican to stand behind the raped women of Ukraine, to allow abortion and the possibility actually of abortion. Just to make a parallel with the Islamic community in Bosnia in 1992, the Islamic community in Bosnia in 1982 brought a fatwa allowing abortion of rape for women who wanted to abort as a result of rape from imams. So in these times, with these circumstances, we have to bring these difficult decisions, and that's something which currently needs to be done with the victims of Bucha and Mariupol and all the other cities in Ukraine.
May I just add something to this, please, Laura?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for asking this. And I obviously agree with Tanya and Hikmet. And I've been noticing nuances of horror coming from Ukraine, in the sense that, for example, a journalist from Kiev Independent, Anastasia Lapatina, I just pulled it back, wrote a tweet saying that, 2 days ago or yesterday, 2 days ago, at least 25 women and girls as young as 14 were raped by Russians in one basement in Bucha. 9 of them are pregnant. Russian soldiers said, quote, they would rape them to the point where they wouldn't want sexual contact with any man to prevent them from having Ukrainian children. And so I saw that, and then I had, I thought of what paramilitary and Bosnian Serb forces, how they operated. They wanted to make in rape camps Bosniak women pregnant in many cases, so that they could, quote unquote, have Serbian children, right? So it operates on different levels, whether you want to allow abortion, how do you want to traumatize these women and bring destruction to entire communities, right? That's the intention of it. But what I thought when you talked about this, Tanya, is something that many of you are familiar, and it brings us back to denial. And that is, if you remember a big campaign among Bosnian genocide survivors and activists in 2020 about Vilina Vlas hotel, which was on TripAdvisor or on Google, or on TripAdvisor as this place for a spa in Eastern Bosnia. And so many have worked to, wrote a petition to Google to ask to stop promoting this resort, quote unquote, because it was a place of wartime rape and killing of the Bosniaks, which brings us again back to, I don't think that Google did it ultimately, to the online denialism in terms of the digital sphere, and how many challenges are there for all who want to engage, because it's an ocean of things available all the time in English, in Bosnian, in Serbian, top down, from Wikipedia, in terms of all the stuff that we've been mentioning in terms of revisionism of history in Eastern Europe, to the individual narratives, to the bots who are paid. It's incredibly organized. I was retweeted last week by some person who I know triggers the bots. I cannot tell you the avalanche that came right there immediately. And so I want to also applaud and thank to anybody who might be watching this from any community, whether it is, fighting Holocaust distortion or Bosnian genocide denial, because it is almost an incessant work. And asking technological companies about accountability. I know on many fronts, this is a conversation that is ongoing. Talking about media literacy for youth, or just understanding how different platforms operate, is an ongoing conversation. But just one thing that is particularly painful, which brings me always back both to that lived experience and trauma and exhaustion, is that in digital age, as we've seen from reports on anti-Semitism that I've read recently, done by several foundations, it's the methods through trolling, through mocking, through just quote unquote naughty humor, through bad faith actions, and through just really different techniques that are used in this online sphere in terms of different behaviors that just add such a toll on all the people who still have to continue their daily lives and have to deal with these horrific things alongside triumphalism and glorification. I want to mention that because that means that these projects are very well alive. And that's the thing. It's not over. For people in Republika Srpska, for Bosniaks, for returnees, I really can't forget. A couple of months ago, I think it was Amra Begić, Srebrenica Memorial survivor, she tweeted and she said, I wish these were just conversations on Twitter that we could have. But I have to fall asleep with my eyes open and have 2 kids next to me while, people who are war criminals are still walking very freely around. So full circle, thank you for organizing this. I know we're not done, but it's important, I think, what we're doing, because it's it's a fight that I don't know or I don't see end now, especially considering the leadership. And I want to not forget to mention the importance of leadership and the lack of willingness so far in 30 years almost to deal and take responsibility, and actually quite opposite in case of Serbia or Republika Srpska, to embrace these narratives as a tool for greater Serbia expansionism. I've jumped a lot, but very important points raised. Thank you.
I just want to add one more thing about this rape conversation, is that the Bosnian Serb and Serbian leadership have never, ever taken responsibility for these crimes, for the commission of these crimes. And this is already happening in real time, as James said earlier. It's happening in real time by the Russians. The Russians are saying they didn't do it. They didn't do it. Complete denial. It is shredding the idea of credibility. It is absolutely ludicrous when you see the evidence. And about the crimes with regard to women, they are traumatized forever. They are required to do a hell of a lot of work, personal work, psychological work. They may have chronic medical conditions for the rest of their lives. And I don't want to omit men. Men were raped too, and raped and sexually assaulted. And this is a part of these kinds of wars. When you're talking about ethnic wars, you're talking about a proliferation of atrocities that are quite brutal. And in the last 25 to 30 years, almost all these wars have been ethnic, and you have seen a proliferation of rape and sexual assault of civilians.
Want to invite James into the conversation.
Thank you, Laura. I was going to go back a little bit in this conversation. Tanya mentioned comfort women during the Second World War and before the Second World War. We often forget to mention how maybe up to 2 million German women were raped by the Soviet liberating forces after the Second World War. And I've always found this very difficult leading a Holocaust museum in the UK. How and where do you talk about this? Because it could feed into relativization of the Holocaust. And I think there's been a reluctance in the Holocaust Memorial world. I'm not sure about the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, but in the UK, we don't touch on it. And I think it's partly because Germans, of course, framed as the perpetrators, and therefore presenting the victimhood of German women doesn't fit well, and it's sort of a crime that was outside of the Holocaust. It was also committed by one of the main allies, which would complicate things at Nuremberg, and I know it's a difficult subject. Robert mentioned victor's justice earlier. However, it does need to be said that there was a complete lack of accountability for the most horrific rape of German women after the Second World War, and that lack of accountability hasn't helped the current situation today. But thankfully, I think it also ought to be said there has been some progress in international law, and taking into account the statistics, Tanya, of one prosecution out of 20,000 is horrific. So I barely dare say this, but yeah, at the ICTR, there was a lot of debate, and it was Rwandan survivors who really pressed for rape to be recognized as a weapon of genocide, a crime of genocide. And even in the Gacaca courts, it was sort of initially this low-level crime, but was escalated up to the top category crime, and it took a long time. And there are similar statistics. Although the crime was recognized, it was very rarely prosecuted in Rwanda, and most of the women that were infected with HIV/AIDS died before they could even be given treatment. And anyway, we're going to go off into a completely different subject, but just, I mean, I never forget 10 years after the genocide, the debates that were going on in Rwanda, there were thousands of women dying of HIV who'd been raped. And the debate at the time was, well, we can't preferentially give them antiretrovirals, partly because there's a nutrition problem. Well, if I solve the nutrition problem then, oh, well, then it's going to create resentment in the wider population because there are other women with HIV and it will look like we're favoring Tutsis. So the solution was to let them die. They were dying of genocide 10 years after the genocide was supposed to have ended. And you know, the international community just couldn't bring itself to preferentially bring medication to thousands of women that were dying in front of our eyes. It was just a you know, horrific situation. Thankfully, eventually, the policies adapted and changed, but it was just another example of the role of rape and gender and genocide. So I just wanted to add that to the points that Tanya had already eloquently made.
No, and I think, you know, just to put this in context for the people that are also viewing the event, this denial of sexual violence is very much part and parcel of dehumanizing people, and not talking about it is another way of minimizing. This is how, you know, the perpetrating communities minimize what's taken place. So we're talking about the communal level, the individual level, the regional level, and the national level. And I think just in terms of, you know, as we're heading into the last 10 minutes of discussion, you know, I'm kind of struck by, Robert, you represent the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and we've spoken a lot about your role individually versus representing the organization. James, you're an activist. You've been involved with the memorialization and prevention of genocide in many different contexts. And Hikmet and Riada, you are both scholars and commentators, but also people who are living very much inside and from a culture in Bosnia where this is rife. And I was wondering if you could each comment a little on the impact that this has on your lives and why you do this work.
Hikmet, would you like to go first? It doesn't.
Yeah,
Or
sure.
Robert or anybody.
Sure. Well, I mean, basically, I think that in order to do this line of work, you really need to have a large level of motivation and some sort of personal, you know, touch in some sense. My dad is from Visegrad, from Eastern Bosnia. So, you know, one of my cousins ended up in Vilna Vas. He was found in and then I have two more uncles still missing from Visegrad. So, you know, it really is a personal thing. My great-grandmother, who was 92 years old, survived the First World War, the Second World War, and 1982. So, you know, I don't know, it really has to be some way a personal touch in order to deal with these issues, because these things, you know, as much as you know, put all your trust into mental health and so on, it's really exhausting dealing with these topics for a long period of time, and it's emotionally draining, you know. So the reason why I have the motivation to do this is basically the level of denial which is going on. I mean, I sometimes joke that if there was no denial, I probably would you know, start dealing with some other topics currently. But you know, the more denial there is, the more motivation I have to work. So you know, currently that's my main motivation.
Riada?
Thank you, Hikmet. Yes, ditto to everything he said. I personally have not been in Bosnia between 92 and 95, while members of my mother's side of the family who lived in the eastern part of the country, in Visegrad, precisely the same town, suffered, escaped, or were killed. And Hikmet actually wrote about my mother's uncle, Dr. Safet Zeynilovic, as part of the eliticide in Visegrad. And I thank Hikmet once again publicly for putting that on paper. And the reason why I do it is because I have heard and I have been listening from my grandfather the stories about our family history across the Balkans, whether it is in Montenegro, whether it is in Kosovo, whether it is in Bosnia, about the consequences of the ideologies and the place of Bosniaks and Muslims from the Balkans in this greater Serbia or Serbian ideology. And I just accidentally missed Bosnian genocide. But then a few years later, I had to escape from Pristina, where I was. And so I was a refugee, and the cousins that we hosted in 92 from Visegrad hosted us in 99. After one of my uncles was executed. And so the reason why I do this is because it is the killing, the intentional killing, extermination on such massive scale. The denial, the intent, the glorification, and the triumphalism is something that nobody should take lightly, but obviously we of those people take it the most and the closest to our hearts. And I will say that even well-intended friends, I have to say that sometimes when I have conversations with them here in United States, they will say, but they don't care when I say they don't care. And it just struck me once to understand that, but we care, right? We care, we have to care, we will care. So we will continue this work. And the fact that this political project is alive is the scariest part of it all, because besides an atrocity committed in the memorialization part of it that a lot of survivors of different genocide as well deal with, we have these political projects. We have the institutional denial in Republika Srpska and Republika Serbia as part of these projects. So I fear for my family that's there. I fear because it's unjust. The last thing that I will say again before thanking all those who continuously work in Srebrenica Memorial Center, I'm so thankful that we have them finally, such a team of scholars, educators, is to say that I always tell my audiences that we have to allow each other to share the truth about Bosnian genocide in different ways, regardless of what our profession is. That just as a genocide scholar or as a journalist, we have artists, we have professionals, architects, dentists, whoever it might be. There is space for all of us to carry a part of this the way that it suits us in terms of also saving our mental health. And sorry I don't want to take time, because I've noticed Bosnian genocide survivors, just like from Syria as well, offering such solidarity to Ukrainians online. It's beautiful. But I've also noticed Bosnian genocide survivors who have said, I had to go off Twitter for a couple of days because I've been re-traumatized, because my PTSD has been re-triggered. And so what does that say again about the beginning of my presentation about the lived experience? How much is that worth to those that we speak to? So thank you again for recognizing the value in it, to the organizers, to all my fellow panelists, and to everybody in the audience who's taken the time to be here and listen to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Riad. I wanted to open it up to Robert and James.
Okay, thank you, Robert. So having helped to set up the UK's National Holocaust Centre with my brother Stephen, I went to, and we did that as non-Jews who had visited the Holocaust Museum in Israel, because there was a need in the UK. We hadn't learned about the Holocaust at school, and felt that we should try and share this our own experience. But the centre having opened, genocide happened in Rwanda as we were building it. 2 months before it opened, the genocide in Srebrenica occurred, and it troubled me and challenged me. I went, however, back to my medical career. I was training to be a surgeon, and it was in that capacity that I volunteered to go with International Medical Corps to Kosovo. Actually, it was in Albania in 1999. I worked with a Kosovan Albanian doctor from Prizren, who told me how she'd had her bags packed for 3 months before the sort of ethnic cleansing. And it just struck me that, how did you know? How did you know to have your bags packed? If you knew, there must be something, there must be some signs. Of course, in retrospect, we've been talking about them today. The signs were there, the fear and the incitement and the distortion. And I felt very strongly from a medical perspective, if we see signs of a pandemic or of cancer at an early stage, we do something about it. We research, we try and understand and have interventions, and that's what motivated me to help set up the Aegis Trust, and why I've worked with the government of Rwanda and with survivors in Rwanda for the past 20 years or so at the Kigali Genocide Memorial, helping to develop programs of prevention there. And why? What motivates is, again, listening to the stories of survivors. I was not going to spend long in Rwanda, but hearing the survivors that we were talking about, observing women dying from genocide 10 years after the genocide was supposedly ended, was a huge motivation to just be involved and play a very small role in trying to stop the distortion that we've been talking about, communicate to future generations, and find interventions, particularly through education, that can help to build resilience against these kind of crimes. So that's why I'm here. And thank you so much to the Harriman Institute, Tanya and Laura, for bringing us together. It's, again, I've learned so much today. It's and this kind of experience motivates me, because meeting fellow travelers who are committed and doing fantastic work and helping to enlighten us is part of that motivation.
Yes, I'll begin with thanks, because I know we are low on time. But before I actually get into my personal motivations, I want to go back to this issue of gender violence very quickly, and just as an observation from somebody who fled the academy after getting his PhD. I think another couple of dynamics that are at play. There's a lack of appreciation for the degrees of gender violence due to two factors. One, many academic departments still maintain, at least mentally, a paternalistic approach to the field, even though gender dynamics have begun to balance out in certain departments. I think that overall underlying motivation is still there. That's probably going to get me into trouble for saying, but that is my belief, not necessarily that of my institution. I think the other factor that we've seen, at least in Holocaust studies, is in growing degrees to which scholars who try to attempt addressing these topics of gender violence are intimidated, either through lawsuits, the threats of lawsuits, lack of access to archives, and other factors, other real world factors. So I think we need to address those if we're going to begin looking at this subject in a more holistic way. Personal motivations. Why am I in the field? There are two. Why? I guess the question in my case is, why is a Catholic kid from Kentucky doing this? And there are really two factors. I grew up in a part of the country where anti-Semitism was ever present, even though right across the river in Cincinnati, you have the home of Reform Judaism in the United States. So engaging with people, not my family, thank goodness, but who had anti-Semitic beliefs always struck me as rather odd and out of place, especially in light of the Holocaust. The other factor, though, actually relates to the war crimes that took place in the 1990s. It occurred to me as I was studying for another field. I was supposed to have become a physician like James. It occurred to me that violence is just around the corner because of what I had seen happening in the Western Balkans. And that violence was not being perpetrated by a hooded man in a cloak with red eyes. It was being perpetrated by people like us, people who look like us. And I think that's also something that's coming home very much today in the Ukrainian case. And I think those two factors are what drove me in the field and what continues to motivate me to address the field. Fortunately, my thinking has evolved, and I now recognize that we need not only address genocide or mass atrocity crimes in the European or North American context, but on a global scale, but that many of the same dynamics are there. So by teaching this particular history from the past and reflecting on its relevance today, the hope is that it will inspire some action in a positive direction down the line.
Thank you so much. And Tanya, I wanted to, offer the floor to you for some closing remarks.
Sure. Yes, I want to thank everybody on this panel. This has been an incredible conversation, and I don't want it to be the last one. I am going to follow up in an email to everybody about some of the thoughts we have going forward. Today is a remarkable day, and several people said it. I know Riata said it. I think James said it. I don't want to shortchange anybody, but we scheduled this because we feel, Laura Cohen and I feel, that this is a very important issue. It's a palpable issue in the region. And when we look at the world right now, the rise of autocracy, the rise of nationalism, this is when you could be on the doorstep of another horrible massacre and, quite frankly, mass death, mass atrocities, which we unfortunately are watching in real time in Ukraine. So these issues are quite real, and there remains an existential threat in the Western Balkans, in the Balkans at large, from Moscow. This remains a very disconcerting, and the failure of diplomats at this time is also very disconcerting. So these issues, they don't like to talk about these issues. They don't want to talk about the past, and they don't want to talk about what might happen, the lack of prevention. So I feel the conversation today is part of that prevention, part of discussing what has taken place in the past and what our concerns are about the moment. And then actually, as everybody here, the intersection of these issues and the connection between genocide denial and Holocaust distortion has been discussed here. And I'm not sure it's discussed as much as it needs to be, but this was our moment to do it. And I want to thank each of you. I'm deeply moved by your comments and about your personal commitment. I want to also recognize Andre de Munter, who's a colleague from the EU. He's been making comments, and he's a fellow traveler. He's very committed to the Balkans in his work at the EU, and they need somebody like Andre there. We need to keep him there in Brussels because they need guidance too. So on behalf of the Harriman Institute and my colleague Laura Cohen, I want to thank everybody for your participation. This will be on YouTube channel of the Harriman Institute. So I ask people to share it broadly. I look forward to further communication and collaborations with all of you, and maybe some new collaborations. So on behalf of Harriman, I wish all of you a good day wherever you might be.